You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
This Father's Day, do more with Dad and spend less with low prices guaranteed at the Home Depot. Get him fired up with a new grill and accessories, like the Next Grill 5-burner for just $299, so you can spend more time together while he becomes the grill master he was always meant to be. Or build memories with savings on top brand power tools so you can tackle projects side by side. Gift more and do more together this Father's Day with help from the Home Depot. Exclusions apply. See homedepot.com/price match for details.
Expedia and Visit Scotland invite you to come step into centuries of history that await in Scotland. Castles steeped in legend, walk along cobblestone streets. Come share the warmth of stories passed down through generations. This is a place with a past that is fully present today and all yours to explore. Plan your Scottish escape today at expedia.com/Visit Scotland.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 261, Crete Part 6, Stick It Out. This week, a big thank you goes out to Goran, Nick, and Jim for supporting the podcast by becoming members. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. While the situation on land was not developing in favor of the British and their Greek allies, the Royal Navy was still out there supporting where it could. May 22nd had been a simply disastrous day for the senior service, because while it had been able to prevent the delivery of German mountain forces in their convoys, the Luftwaffe had struck back with a vengeance that would leave multiple British ships at the bottom of the ocean and many more damaged. As soon as the German airborne invasion of Crete started, the Royal Navy put into place its plan to assist the defense of the island by essentially preventing any reinforcements from arriving. To do this, several Royal Navy task forces were put together with the goal of always maintaining a strong Royal Navy presence on the north side of Crete during the hours of darkness, during which any invading convoy would have to move through the waters on their way to their landing beaches. This was not the root of any problems, and was exactly the sort of job that the Royal Navy was well prepared to do, and to do well. There was, of course, the Luftwaffe problem, though. The presence of the Luftwaffe in southern Greece had essentially ended the ability of the Royal Air Force to base aircraft on Crete, as they simply could not keep up with the slow attrition that would be inflicted upon squadrons based on the island. The RAF was already spread thin with all of its other responsibilities around the Mediterranean, and reinforcements simply could not be fed into Crete endlessly. This meant that by the time of the invasion, due to concerted efforts by the Luftwaffe, there was no RAF presence on the island, which meant that the Royal Navy had to fend for itself. Obviously, the threat of attack from the air was a threat that the Royal Navy was prepared for, and its ships were equipped with large numbers of anti-aircraft guns for defense. One of the major problems that would develop for the Royal Navy around Crete was that these anti-aircraft weapons had limited ammunition available aboard each ship, and during the first 3 days of the invasion, they were under constant aerial harassment from the Luftwaffe. Even if these attacks did very little real damage before May 22nd, the slow and steady pressure started to wear down the ammunition magazines of the British ships. By the 22nd, many of the cruisers and destroyers were down to less than half of their anti-aircraft ammunition, and some were even below 20% on their most important types of anti-aircraft guns. The solution to this problem was to go back to Alexandria for resupply, which was required from time to time for fuel as well. But when a task force rotated out and went back to Alexandria, there would be fewer Royal Navy ships in place to achieve their goal, and so these movements back to Alexandria had to be properly staggered and scheduled. All of these problems came to a head on May 22nd, the day after the German invasion convoys were encountered. The cruisers and destroyers did their job. They turned around both German convoys, but in doing so, they would spend more time to the north of Crete than they originally planned. This also meant that they would spend more time within range of the Luftwaffe after dawn and during the early morning hours. This, when combined with the shortage of anti-aircraft ammunition, would set the stage for a series of air attacks that would cost the Royal Navy the destroyer Greyhound and the cruisers Gloucester and Fiji. Between the three losses, around 1,000 sailors would also be lost. Along with the ships that were just straight up sunk, 6 more suffered notable damage, including the battleships Warspite and Valiant. Warspite often received special focus in histories because it would be hit by multiple bombs, which would result in damage bad enough that it would have to go all the way to the United States to be repaired. This took a capital ship essentially off the board at a critical time for the British position in the Mediterranean. Any further damage to other ships was prevented by the arrival of night on the 22nd, with the Luftwaffe not really being in a position to launch any kind of night attacks, which gave the Royal Navy a reprieve after a very long day. The problem was that it was possible that the Germans would try another set of landings during the night, and so the decision was made to send the 5th Destroyer Flotilla and its 3 destroyers on a sweep north of the island. The rest of the forces would continue moving south towards Alexandria, and more importantly, away from danger. During the night, the destroyers, which were led by Captain Lord Louis Mountbatten, would not encounter any German naval forces, and before dawn, they began heading south to put distance between them and the Luftwaffe, but it would not be enough. The air attacks began just after 7 a.m., and the Kashmir would be hit by a bomb, which would result in it sinking quite quickly. Even with all of these losses that were being added to on seemingly a daily basis, Admiral Cunningham remained adamant that the fleet must not let the defenders of the island down. And late on the 22nd, even after the losses of the day, he would send a signal to the fleet, "Stick it out. Navy must not let Army down. No enemy forces must reach Crete by sea." End quote. On the 23rd, it did not appear he was any closer to giving up and going home. But also, he would not need to hold out for much longer because soon after the 22nd, real plans began to be put in place to begin the evacuation. Even after the greater part of the fleet was out of danger on the 23rd, there were still fleet operations that would take place over the night of the 23rd and into the 24th. During the hours of darkness, the destroyers Defender and Jaguar would make a quick trip into Suda Bay to unload some supplies for the defending forces near the area. They would be able to make their way south during the early morning hours. While this movement was happening back in Alexandria, the various cruisers and destroyers that had played their roles in the actions of May 21st and 22nd were rapidly being prepared for another sortie back to Crete. The first to go back out would be the cruisers Ajax and Dido, joined by the destroyers Imperial, Kimberly, and Hotspur. The goal for this collection of ships was the same as all the previous groups: be sure that they were in position to intercept any German forces that were attempting to reach Crete by sea. It's worth noting that May 24th, 1941, which would be the date when some of these fleet movements were happening, was also the same time that the hunt for the Bismarck was occurring in the Atlantic. During that operation, in which the German battleship Bismarck had found its way into the North Atlantic, the focus of the Royal Navy, almost every single bit of focus back in London, was on the Bismarck. The 24th specifically would be the date for the Battle of the Denmark Strait, during which the HMS Prince of Wales and the HMS Hood would engage the Bismarck, with the Hood exploding from a hit by a 15-inch shell from the German battleship. So the 24th was not a good day for the Royal Navy as a whole, although better news would arrive on the 27th when the Bismarck would meet its end. Now, that was halfway around the world. The podcast will also get there here quite soon. But I did just want to point that out because it's interesting to see how sometimes when we focus on one set of actions, one campaign, one battle, it's easy to forget that it's happening within a world war. There are so many things happening sometimes. Back in Alexandria, Cunningham would arrange for a bit of offensive action with some of their resources available. The key point would be the aircraft carrier Formidable, which had more aircraft loaded aboard in Alexandria. It would be accompanied by 2 battleships and a collection of destroyers, and this collection of ships would become known as Force A and would leave Alexandria on May 25th. The target for the operation were the airfields used by the Luftwaffe on the island of Carpathos. Carpathos was known as Scarpanto by the Italians, and it was an important staging ground for the Luftwaffe because it was positioned to the east side of Crete, about halfway between Crete and the island of Rhodes. This offensive action was a bold move, particularly given the fact that the Formidable had far from its full complement of aircraft, and the raid would take place on the 26th, and it would be carried out by 6 bombers and 4 accompanying fighters, for fighters being everything that the Formidable had at this point. These aircraft would be launched about 100 miles southwest of the island. Then they would successfully attack the airfield. It would actually go quite well. In fact, during the attack, several German aircraft would be damaged or destroyed. But given its overall size, just a couple of bombers, the real impact that the raid could have on the course of events was quite limited. At the same time, further strikes could not be launched due to the threat posed by the Luftwaffe, with Force A very rapidly making its way back south after aircraft were recovered. Even this quick movement was not enough, and early in the afternoon, a raid of 28 German aircraft split between Stukas and Ju-88s would move in on the British ships. These aircraft had actually been based in North Africa, which meant that the movement of the Royal Navy force to the south was not a problem for them because they were coming from the south as well. The only available fighters for the Formidable, 4 Fulmars, would rise to meet the German attack and would shoot down 3 of the slower Stukas, although 1 of the British fighters would also be lost. 3 bombs would hit the Formidable, unfortunately for the Formidable, and while it would be able to recover aircraft and make its way back to Alexandria, it was essentially out of action for the rest of 1941, because much like the Warspite, it would eventually have to be sent back to the United States for repairs to be completed. During this action, the destroyer Nubian would also be hit and would be out of action until late in 1942, and the battleship Barham would be hit by a bomb on one of its turrets, which would start a major fire that fortunately did not cause any major damage, but certainly caused some problems. So you can see with this attack that even when the British Royal Navy tried to do something proactive in these areas, they were at such a disadvantage due to their complete inability to have any kind of air support or air defense for their forces, that everything they did around Crete was a risk, and sometimes that risk paid off, sometimes it really, really, really did not. As you might guess, I love history podcasts, but there's something special about going to the place where the history happened. Chase History Tours can help take you there. Chase History Tours has a special early bird rate on their 2026 Christmas Markets and History Tour, which is a 10-day adventure through France, Germany, and Austria. The founder of Chase History Tours, Will Clark, will accompany you through Strasbourg, Nuremberg, Munich, and other gorgeous locations. During the 10-day tour, an entire day is dedicated to the important role that Nuremberg would play before, during, and after the Second World War, including a visit to the Nazi Party rally grounds and Courtroom 600, where the Nuremberg trials took place. You'll also have some time in Munich, should you wish to visit a certain beer hall of Push fame. Will has partnered with local historians in each location, and the group will be small, capped at just 16 guests. That's a small group, local experts, really cool-looking history markets, the footsteps of history. There's a lot to like here. You can head over to chasehistorytours.com to see a full itinerary of this trip, and also to reserve your spot. Go to chasehistorytours.com and use the code SWW to get 10% off. That is chasehistorytours.com, and look for their Christmas Markets and History Tour.
So good, so good, so good.
New markdowns up to 70% off are at Nordstrom Rack stores now. Stock up and save big on shoes, tops, dresses, accessories, and more must-haves for summer. Join the Nordy Club to unlock exclusive discounts, shop new arrivals first, and more. Plus, buy online and pick up at your favorite Rack store for free. Great brands, great prices. That's why you Rack.
The efforts of the Royal Navy during the first 5 days of the fighting on Crete, even if it was costly, would be an important part of preventing German reinforcements from arriving by sea. However, there was absolutely nothing that the Royal Navy could do to prevent the constant flow of supplies via the airlift that would take place from between Greece and the airfields around Malmö. And equally, it appeared that there was nothing that the British and Greek ground forces on the island could do to prevent the Germans from expanding their area of control and pushing east. Among the British leaders on the island, the conversations very rapidly shifted from one of how best to defend the lines to the west of Suda Bay to one of how to begin the evacuation. Just like every other time that the Royal Navy had evacuated the British Army over the previous months of the war, this evacuation would be risky. The previous days of fighting had proven that fact beyond all doubt, which would cause there to be some discussion among General Wavell and Air Chief Marshal Tedder of perhaps the men on Crete being left there to surrender. They obviously did not want so many men to become prisoners of the Germans, but they were staring down the risk of the complete destruction of the Royal Navy's power in the Eastern Mediterranean. During these conversations, Admiral Cunningham would give one of the more famous quotes of the war during this period. It would go something like this, but this is recorded by a member of his staff, so there may be a little fudging with the wording, but it's a pretty good quote. Quote, "It has always been the duty of the Navy to take the Army overseas to battle, and if the Army fail, to bring them back again. If we now break with that tradition, ever afterwards when soldiers go overseas, they will tend to look over their shoulders instead of relying on the Navy. You have said, General Wavell, that it will take 3 years to build a new fleet. I will tell you that it will take 300 years to build a new tradition." End quote. Again, a very good quote, and if the wording has been given a bit of extra flourish, I'm sure the sentiment was the same during the discussion. But no matter how determined Cunningham was to execute the evacuation, there would still be severe constraints on the freedom of action of the Royal Navy. Notably, they had to be as far away from Crete as possible by dawn every single day. It was also essential that as many of the defenders on the island as possible begin retreating to the south so that the naval ships could come to evacuate them there instead of having to travel to the north side of the island, with every hour spent getting to the pickup point being one fewer hour that men could be loaded aboard before they had to beat a hasty retreat. So if the men were on the south side of the island, it was very likely that more of them would be evacuated. On the island, Freiburg was already mentally moving towards evacuation, particularly as it became clear that the defensive lines that had been established to the east of Malmö would not be sufficient to hold back the German attacks. On May 26th, he would send a message to Wavell that he believed that evacuation was the only option. As plans began to be made for how the evacuation would take place, the British would benefit from one major mistake made by the German commander on the island, General Ringel. When he was trying to predict what the British would do, he predicted that they would continue to fight along the island, continuing to move to the east and trying to join up with the British and Greek forces that had successfully resisted the opening moves of the German invasion in those areas around Rethemno and Heraklion. But Freiburg's plans, which were confirmed by Wavell on the afternoon of the 27th, was to move almost all of his forces south to areas on the southern coast of the island that would meet Cunningham's request that evacuations take place from the south. This disconnect between what the Germans thought the British would do and what the British would actually do would save the defenders of Crete and the Royal Navy from an even greater disaster. Ringel could have used his forces to cut the paths to the south, repositioning forces onto his right flank and pushing forward as rapidly as possible to prevent the British retreat. But he did not do that, and instead he would push along the northern coast, the precise area that the British were now frantically trying to get away from. The British goal was to move to Sphakia on the southern coast, where the plan was for the Royal Navy to begin the evacuations on the night of May 28th. The retreat of the units to the south ended up looking a lot like most army retreats during the war, a mixture of chaos and exhaustion. The mass of men moving south in the heat of the day were soon discarding everything that was not absolutely essential to their survival. Vehicles that had stopped working, gas masks, blankets, every kind of supply and equipment, and their rifles and ammunition. Anything that could be discarded was discarded, in the name of making the trudge south seem a little bit more possible. One of the men involved, Sergeant Stewart, would write, quote, "It was pitiful to see the state and marching of the British soldiers. Some lacking rifles or equipment, discipline seemed to have left them. I do not blame the men altogether. And they had sore feet through sweat and marching, the skin peeling off their shoulders with carrying extra ammunition and their comrades' rifles." End quote. The units of the rear guard had it even worse because they were still expected to be in a condition to at least slow the German advance. To make matters worse for these units, food became a major issue quite quickly. Efforts were made to begin moving supplies to the south along with the men, and then those supplies were often consumed by the men closest to them, the ones furthest to the south, which left little for the forces at the back of the retreat, who were actually supposed to still be fighting. This could have been addressed with proper preparations and the allocation of supplies for units as they marched, in dumps along the route of retreat or by some other method, but there had not been time or transport to make that happen. Rations were cut multiple times during their short retreat, but luckily it would be over after only a few days. One of the odd facts of the evacuations was that while the evacuations were being planned for Sphakia, and the British forces were moving in that direction and would eventually be picked up over the course of a few nights, at Heraklion, similar evacuations were ordered. However, the troops involved would be far more confused than relieved, I guess, by the information. Early on the morning of the 28th, the orders would arrive at Brigadier Chappell's headquarters that his men would be evacuated on that night by the Royal Navy. This news would trickle down to the units and eventually the men throughout the afternoon and evening, and often caused confusion because nothing had been going wrong at Heraklion for the British and Greeks. But orders were orders, and the evacuation preparations began. Vehicles were disabled by having their engines run without oil until they seized up. Breech blocks were removed from guns and buried along with the ammunition. As much as possible, supplies were rendered useless, and every type of equipment was destroyed. There were also a few instances where officers and men made the great sacrifice of ensuring that food and alcohol did not fall into the hands of the Germans by committing to serious consumption, which I'm sure was very hard work. The evacuation would then proceed exactly as planned, with the arrival of 2 cruisers and 6 destroyers commanded by Rear Admiral Rawlings. They would arrive at 11:30 p.m., and an orderly evacuation would begin, with the destroyers loading men aboard off of a pier and then shuttle runs being made to the cruisers until they were full up. After the destroyers were full, the destroyers loaded up all they could on each one of them, and eventually everybody was on their way. Just under 3,500 men were brought aboard over the course of only a few hours, including a few unexpected guests, 4 women, 12 Greek soldiers, and 6 Cretan civilians that managed to find their way on board. Unfortunately for the men involved with the journey from Heraklion, it would be far more dangerous than the movement of getting onto the ships. The problem started when the destroyer Imperial had its steering gears jam, which required another destroyer, the Hotspur, to turn around and load up everybody from the Imperial. The entire force was slowed to allow the Hotspur to then catch up, because they had to be together by dawn. Any ship left by itself would almost certainly fall prey to the Luftwaffe. But this meant that when dawn arrived, the force as a whole was far behind schedule, and just as expected, the Luftwaffe would not be far behind the sun into the sky. For 6 hours, the attacks continued, with the destroyer Hereward eventually being damaged to the point where it would sink. Multiple other ships, including the 2 cruisers, were badly damaged by the attacks throughout the day, but they would be able to continue to limp south. In total, 260 men would be killed and 280 wounded by the German air attacks. Just the next in a long line of reminders of how dangerous the waters around Crete would be for the Royal Navy as they began the much larger effort of removing the men from Sphakia, an effort that we will talk about next episode.